More and more, it seems, we live in the era of the forced apology. And therefore, it's refreshing to see one man, Professor Alessandro Strumia, a theoretical particle physicist, refusing to apologize for defending science from feminist ideology. Not surprisingly, that man is now being denounced by thousands of his colleagues, and that's my subject on today's Fiamengo file. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. It is a truth universally acknowledged that any academic field in which the number of women is not at least equal to the number of men, and preferably double, must be a field in which sexism is keeping women out. Any man who contends that there is no sexism in his field is immediately held up as one of sexism's most dangerous exemplars. Of course, we're talking about elite fields in academia, not dirty and dangerous male-dominated jobs like frontline soldiering, long-haul trucking, garbage collection, street paving, commercial fishing, mining, logging, roofing, construction, sewer repair, and so on. The feminists just aren't interested in getting more women into these jobs, and therefore these jobs are never the focus of panels of outraged experts or public statements by academics who've made comfortable, well-paying careers enforcing male guilt. When Professor Alessandro Strumia of the University of Pisa came to a conference of the European Organization for Nuclear Research, or CERN, a conference on high-energy theory and gender, he must have known that a non-feminist presentation would go over about as well as Galileo's subversive cosmology pleased the Inquisition in 1633. According to the Church of Feminism, all men in STEM must manifest a deep concern about the declared woman problem and must pledge to make ever greater efforts, even including perhaps sacrificing the best and brightest, if necessary, in order to meet diversity goals. And by the way, as we all know, this is a church in which confessing your sins won't bring any forgiveness, so don't even think about it. Now, this is a longish video, so you might want to skip to the end, but I hope you'll agree with me that it's a subject worth the time, because what happened to Professor Strumia last month is a stark symbol of the attack on truth being waged by social justice warriors in science. As Strumia mentioned in his presentation, physics has always been a special community of researchers dedicated to understanding the truth of nature. Physics requirements are rigorous intellectual honesty and reliance on quantitative evidence. Physics cannot flourish when these requirements are suppressed for any social goal. So let's look at what Professor Strumia did that got him unpersoned by his fellow academics. In short, he created a series of graphs to show that far from being discriminated against, women are significantly advantaged over men in physics hiring, promotion, and financial assistance, and that claims of bias against women, which we hear so frequently, simply don't rest on any hard evidence. Now, I encourage everyone to read through Strumia's presentation, which is linked below, and judge for yourself whether he made his case or not. I won't go through the entire presentation, but I will highlight his main findings and the outrageous backlash he received, a backlash that included the accusation that he dismissed the ability of scientists of color, even though he never mentioned race in his findings at all. And before I start, let me thank two brilliant friends of mine, one who works in astronomy and the other who works in physics. They helped me to decipher some of the arguments made by and against Strumia. Thanks to my husband also for listening to many versions of this text. So, to turn to the presentation that caused all the fuss. On page 8 of his talk, Professor Strumia looked at the claim made in a 2016 paper that women's contributions to physics are passed over because male physicists tend not to cite papers with female-first authors. Strumia analyzed the data and found that both male and female researchers cited more papers with male-first authors to the same degree. Male-authored papers were more often cited by both men and women, likely because he suggested the male-authored papers were more significant, not because of any bias against women. On page 12 of his presentation, Strumia considered the evidence for bias against women in physics hiring by plotting the number of citations male and female researchers have typically had when hired into their first job. This is really fascinating evidence. Citations, which are the number of times one's published work is cited by others, obviously, are one major way of determining the quality of a person's research. The more cited, the more significant and influential. Up until 1995, Strumia found, male and female researchers had a comparable number of citations when first hired. There was no discrimination. But since 1995, female researchers have been typically hired with less than half of the citations a male PhD graduate has needed to be hired. In other words, over the last 23 years, from 1995 to the present, hiring has been overwhelmingly stacked against men. And I've seen this with my own eyes also. Discrimination against men at the same time that feminists have been complaining nonstop that more needs to be done to hire women into all academic fields. And what Strumia found about initial hirings held for male and female scientists being hired out of one job into another at later points in their careers also. On page 14, he showed that female scientists are at whatever stage hired with fewer citations than male scientists. In addition, bias against men extends to the awarding of fellowships also. On page 15 of his presentation, Strumia showed that the average number of citations for young male physicists awarded prestigious CERN fellowships is about twice the number of citations for female CERN fellows. So, in other words, CERN fellowships are being awarded regularly to lesser qualified female physicists because they're female. On page 16, Strumia showed that male physicists are more productive, again by a factor of 2, than female physicists throughout the whole course of their careers. Why do men outperform women in physics overall? Strumia hypothesizes that the intellectually honest answer is that more men than women have the desire and skills to do very high-level physics. And this is most likely because there are more men clustered at the very highest levels of intelligence, according to the standard deviation models, which is not to say that there aren't women who are brilliant at physics, just not as many as men, because men's IQ distribution is broader, and that's what accounts for the fact that there are more men in physics. There is no plot against women. In fact, right now there is a plot, so to speak, against men. So if we care about what is best for physics, we should stop pretending, at least this is the implication, I think, of Strumia's research, we should stop pretending that heroic measures are needed to guarantee female participation. Well, reaction to Strumia's presentation was swift and harsh. The video of his talk was immediately removed from the CERN website, so we can't watch it to see if it really was, as CERN officials claimed, quote, highly offensive. According to CERN authorities, Strumia stepped over the line of acceptable conduct by naming a person present at the conference, saying that in a competition for a theoretical physics position at the National Institute of Nuclear Physics in Padua, a woman with far fewer citations than he was given the position. In fact, as he showed in his presentation, he had 10 times the number of citations she had. This was interpreted by CERN authorities as an attack, which they stated was, quote, contrary to the CERN Code of Conduct, end quote. Strumia was immediately suspended from CERN pending an investigation, and his home university, the University of Pisa, has opened an ethics investigation into his conduct. Now, one can disagree about whether Professor Strumia stepped over the line in mentioning this personal factor. Perhaps it was unwise. It definitely gave ammunition to his enemies. In an email he sent to me, Strumia said that he mentioned it in a joking manner. Certainly, in my opinion, his suspension from CERN was excessively punitive, given that much of his talk was pure numbers-based analysis and that the so-called attack appears to have been a simple statement of fact. But the CERN suspension, it wasn't enough for some members of the academic physics community. A public letter condemning Strumia in the strongest of terms, co-authored by 18 mostly US-based physicists, was posted on a website calling itself Particles for Justice. And to date, the letter has received thousands of scientists' signatures, and it's a doozy of a letter. I've read a lot of public statements by far-left intellectuals over the last few years, but I think this one might be the most unhinged I've ever seen. It begins with a histrionic assertion that, quote, the humanity of any person, regardless of ascribed identities, is, quote, not up for debate. The clear implication is that Strumia himself, merely by objecting to feminist policy, was actually in some way calling into question the humanity of women or any other people, which he wasn't. I think everyone who signed this letter should be ashamed of such dishonesty. The co-authors of the letter also lament that Strumia used his physics credentials to pretend he had something to contribute to a discussion of gender bias, which isn't his area of expertise. Though, of course, if he had made a plea for more aggressive measures to promote women in physics, they would never have complained that he lacked the credentials to do so. They continued that, quote, those among us who are familiar with the relevant literature know that Strumia's conclusions are in stark disagreement with those of experts, end quote. This is a classic academic feminist MO. Create a discipline that is based not on scientific methodology, but on untestable claims about privilege, lived experience, intersectionality, and unconscious bias. Then staff the discipline with ideologues who found journals and cite one another in their articles, and then claim that a real scientist has no standing to use quantitative methods to challenge the findings of your fake discipline. Well, in order to show us what only gender experts can see, the letter writers enumerate a series of rebuttals to Strumia's points. Their first and most general criticism is that Strumia, quote, frequently made the basic error of conflating correlation with causation, end quote. Well, this might be a meaningful criticism, but they fail to give a single instance in which it is the case. Where does he do it? Strumia's basic argument is that when feminists claim that something must be done about physics' so-called woman problem, and when it can be shown that less qualified women are being hired in place of more qualified men, then feminist policies are causing discrimination against men in physics. I just don't see where the logical error is. On the other hand, one could certainly argue that the authors of the letter continually confuse correlation with causation. They find that fewer women work in high-level physics and that fewer women win Nobel Prizes in physics, and they conclude that therefore women are discriminated against in physics due to sexism. This is a clear case of correlation not necessarily involving causation. So physicist, heal thyself. The letter writers also include a personal attack on Strumia's research record in order to suggest that he is a mediocrity, bitter about beaten out for a job by a female competitor. For example, they poo-poo his involvement in one experimental paper with thousands of authors, claiming that this one paper accounted for almost 1/3 of his total citations and that his contribution to the paper was likely modest. Well, I call sour grapes. Strumia was included in this very prestigious paper because he worked on the theory of the Higgs boson, a revolutionary concept in understanding how particles acquire mass. It was hardly insignificant. But even if you take away those thousands of citations from that one paper, he still has many, many more than his competitor. And in fact, the vast majority of his papers have few authors and are highly cited. His H index of 82 is knocked down impressive, far better than his competitor's 28. And yes, of course, it's true that quality cannot be measured solely by numbers. Strumia himself never claimed it could be, but there is no doubt that in terms of influence as a scientist, Strumia is the superior candidate, and it is astounding that the letter writers try to pretend he isn't. When it comes to specific rebuttals of Strumia's points, the wobbly logic of the letter writers is even more obvious. Responding to Strumia's demonstration that both men and women cite more male-authored papers than female-first authored papers, the letter writers say that, quote, choice of references is subject to unconscious bias in addition to conscious discrimination. Such unconscious bias is often found at similar levels in both men and women, end quote. So in other words, when women cite more male-first authored papers than female-first authored papers, bias is still in operation because women can be just as biased as men. Wow, this is a real stretch. What happened to the special authority of women's lived experience, which has become the basis for so much feminist theory? If women themselves are just as biased against women as men are said to be biased against women, then how can bias against women be measured at all if there's no unbiased standpoint? And then why is it so important to hire more women into physics if they will merely replicate the biases of their male colleagues? The authors don't pursue this line of reasoning. Instead, they go on to assert that just because women and men both cite more male-first authored research papers, that doesn't mean that there are more significant male-first authored papers. On the contrary, according to the letter writers, the citation rate, quote, only suggests that male and female scientists are equally capable of identifying the most cited papers in their field, end quote. Well, I'm at a loss with this one. It seems to say, correct me if I'm wrong, that these scientists are citing the male-first authored papers only because everyone else is citing them, and that has little, if anything, to do with the importance of the publications. If true, this would seem to suggest that physicists are either incapable or not interested in judging the worth of the research conducted by their fellow scientists, which is quite an astounding assertion that would surely call the entire physics enterprise into question. But the letter writers don't pursue this line of reasoning either. They go on to bridle at Strumia's emphasis on male achievement in physics, including his suggestion that overall more men than women are interested in and talented in very high-level physics. They say, quote, Strumia argues that since the most cited papers are disproportionately by men, this gives evidence that men are intrinsically better at physics. In between intrinsic ability and citation counting, however, there is the huge and complicated process of how physicists are raised, trained, hired, and perceived. Even at the professorial level, discrimination can still play an important role, end quote. Well, first of all, Strumia didn't say that men are intrinsically better at physics. He said that men and women are on average of equal intelligence, but that there are more men who are brilliant at physics, and that men's interests tend to be in things while women's interests tend to be in people. And this is generally recognized in discussions of IQ. He certainly didn't make it up. But the letter writers simply rule this whole area of research out of order. They won't even deal with it. And in the letter, they merely fall back on their standard claim of pervasive bias. But this is even though Strumia has just presented hard evidence that far from experiencing negative bias, women are positively advantaged in all the areas they were referring to, in training, in hiring, in promotion. Once again, the letter writers rely on a classic feminist modus operandi. It doesn't matter how often female advantage can be concretely proven. A generalized, conveniently unmeasurable anti-woman bias can never be absolutely disproven, and therefore it is constantly evoked as if it were a self-evident truth. Unmeasurable factors are again the fail-safe in the letter writer's response to Strumia's graph about women's lesser achievements in physics throughout their careers. They say, quote, Strumia uses as evidence for his case a claim that the number of citations for women increases more slowly than for men as their careers progress. His numbers, however, do not control for many factors, including social expectations that may result in women taking on more primary caregiver roles at home or more departmental roles earlier in their careers, end quote. I have no idea how such factors could possibly be controlled for. So this is a meaningless criticism, in my opinion. And if social expectations are factors in female underachievement in physics, why is it that in many other academic fields in the social sciences and humanities, where presumably women face the same social expectations, women's numbers have increased massively over the past 4 decades? Why would social expectations be a deciding factor only in physics and other mathematics-based disciplines? The letter writers, of course, don't attempt an explanation. Overall, the letter writers make no attempt to seriously analyze Strumia's graphs to show how any of his numbers or inferences are inaccurate. All they've got is their moral outrage. And such outrage powers their concluding ad hominem attack. The letter writers end by pointing to what they call Strumia's, quote, deep contempt for more than half of humanity that clearly comes from some source other than scientific logic, end quote. Well, I suppose they just couldn't resist. Not only were they compelled to denounce Strumia as a misogynist and a racist, even though he said nothing about race, but they had to claim in good Stalinist fashion that he may be mentally ill as well, or at least a hater, as anyone must be who would object to the hiring of less qualified people on the basis of characteristics totally irrelevant to physics. And the letter writers go even further to allege that women and other marginalized people who come into contact with Strumia will suffer from his claimed bigotry. The clear implication being that Strumia's professional colleagues and superiors should actually remove him from positions in which he would supervise graduate students or participate in hiring decisions. The mind boggles at their willingness to make such a vicious allegation. But I guess when you can't rebut someone's argument and when you can't even begin to prove that he actually has contempt for women, the only thing you have left is mob attack in an attempt to ensure that Strumia's professional life never recovers from his decision to call out the BS that passes for serious discussion at a science conference. Well, I can only hope that Strumia's colleagues will resist the call to punishment, that they will recognize the utter irrationality of the letter writer's claims. And yet, thousands of scientists have seen fit to attach their names to this document. Just scroll through the list on the additional page attached to the letter and look at the roll call of shame. Name after name after name of presumably smart people patting themselves on the back for their virtue, finding it easier to shame a leading scientist than to deal honestly with his data. To paraphrase T.S. Eliot, this is the way that physics ends, not with a big bang, but a feminist whimper.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please support us on Patreon. If even half of our subscribers gave us $1 per month, we'd be well on our way to creating more and better content. And don't forget to subscribe to us on Studio Brule.